Now our next speaker, which is Danica Zilkova from the Comenius University in Bratislava. And you will also show us some spectrographic, let's say, analysis.
All right, let me just test if this works. Yeah, perfect. Thank you for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here. We have heard two very interesting talks about how harmful satellites are for spectroscopic observations. And now let's have a look and investigate how spectroscopy can actually help us to study these satellites and their spectra. So we have seen this graph in one way or the other. I will stand like this, it's better for me. And especially in low Earth orbits, the number of satellites had been increasing rapidly lately. And spectroscopy could be the tool to help us identify these objects, characterize and study their changing material properties in the space environment. We started this study a couple of years ago because our university, Comenius University of Bratislava, operates a system of cameras for meteor observation. But as the number of satellites increases, so does the number of recorded satellites by this system. And we have analyzed its spectra, over 70 samples from different satellites, and 3 types of spectra emits the data. And here you can see basically 3 prototypes of different types of spectra, which are demonstrated by 3 different satellite samples. So the first category would be spectra which are convex, and this is demonstrated by spectrum of Telkom satellite. We suspect the spectrum is coming from the solar panels, which are very dominant on this satellite. The second category would be, not yet, would be the spectrum which are increasing towards red wavelengths, and this category is demonstrated by spectrum of Spot 3 satellite, which is covered with golden Kapton or MLI insulation. And the last category are spectra which are flat. That means that the surface basically reflects all of the wavelengths in similar manner, and the resulting spectra is flat. And this spectrum or spectral category is demonstrated by spectrum of ERS2, and we suspect that the source is this flat SAR antenna. However, satellites, the spectra that you saw in the previous page, were all from very, very bright specular glints, and these originate from flat and shiny surfaces. But that's not how a satellite would be shining. I mean, they reflect the sunlight from all of their components, and they are not simple. As you can see in this picture, I mean, satellites or upper stage rockets or all of the, I don't know, space debris, objects, artificial objects in orbit, they have different builds. And when they reflect sunlight, they are going to reflect from all of the components at the same time. So in order to observe complex spectra or diffuse spectra from all of the components, we started a collaboration with Astronomical Institute at the University of Bern in Switzerland, and they operate a 80-centimeter telescope ZIM-Main, which is equipped with a Sheliak-made low-resolution spectrograph, which measures visible wavelengths. We have used the processing software Demetra to process observed spectra of different satellites, and we have performed multiple observation campaigns. And we have selected objects like, let's say LEGIOS. If any of you are familiar, LEGIOS is a calibration sphere. It's a big sphere made of aluminum, which is a very nice sample to observe because you know the whole build of the satellite is made of primarily aluminum. Then we observed, for example, ERS2, because we already seen it from the glints from AMOS cameras. And other types of, let's say, upper stage rockets or even Starlings. And the reduction itself is pretty tricky because when you observe a satellite is reflecting a spectrum from the sun, and you need to extract the spectrum of the sun, but you cannot observe it at the same time. So we observed spectra of solar analog stars, and we kind of adopted reduction techniques from asteroid spectroscopy. And you observe solar analog star at the same time, ideally, and the location as your object, so that you also reduce the effects of atmospheric extinction. So here you can see this is the raw spectrum of Chinese upper stage rocket body, and this is the spectrum of the solar analog. And once you divide the two, for example, the Balmer lines that you can see over here are eliminated, and the spectrum is smooth, except for the fringes over here, but that's just because the pixels are not always perfectly aligned, and sometimes these fringes occur, but it's just a byproduct of the reduction. All right, so to confront our observations, we performed laboratory measurements, and we were quite lucky because we could just unscrew or dismount the spectrograph from our telescope, take it into laboratory back home in Comenius University, and we did some experiments with exactly the same instrument, so same spectrograph, same camera, and we observed reflectance spectra of different materials. Here you can see example of aluminum foil, gallium arsenide solar cell, or DuPont Kapton. All of these materials very commonly used for satellite manufacture. And however, it's not so easy because as you, for example, turn, as you know, the satellites are rotating, as you turn the sample, the spectrum is going to change. And here you can see the changing spectrum of a Kapton foil as you change the rotation towards the source. So here you would have a source and your sample, you rotate it, and the spectrum obviously is going to change a little bit. So you need to account to all of these factors when you're analyzing your spectra. All right, oh yeah, here we see some of the samples. Okay, and now we're looking at the reflectance spectra of some of the samples we observed. So here, in gray and black, you see the spectra of Chinese upper stage rocket here in the picture, and it's painted white. And if you look carefully at the y-axis, I mean, it's a little bit covered, but it starts from 0.6 all the way up to 1.2. So these spectra are roughly flat, a little bit increasing towards red. And they are not the same, and that is because these objects are rotating. So in order to analyze them carefully, you would have to measure, I don't know, with a period of a couple of seconds and see how the spectrum is changing as the objects are rotating. And on top of that, I have spent 3 weeks in La Palma last spring, and part of that collaboration was that they help us to investigate spectrum of 2020 SO, and this object has an odd name because it was first identified as an asteroid and later on identified as the upper stage of the Apollo mission, which is trapped in a cislunar orbit. And here you can see how the 2020 spectrum looks like, and it can be very nicely actually compared to the spectrum of CZ3b 43110. They look almost exactly the same, only shifted a little bit in y-axis. So that's very interesting to see. Okay, so at the moment we are in a position that we have more than 1,000 of spectra. They look something like this. And that makes more than hundreds of gigabytes of data. And the question is, how do we analyze this? Because the thing is, it's not like when you have asteroid spectra, you have absorption bands, and according to the absorption bands, you can figure out the different mineralogies and compositions. But for artificial objects, you have basically, I don't like this. You have basically very flat spectra which are increasing or decreasing, and you can only consider the slope or the overall intensity, or the relative intensity, of course, because, yeah, that's another tricky thing to consider. So in order to somehow study these spectra, we decided we're going to split it into different wavelengths and study them in more detail. So first group would be the blue region, which is from 400 to 500 nanometers. The second one would be visible, from 500 to 655, and then from 655 all the way to 750 nanometers, so that would be the red region. And then we can, I mean, this is just a sample of all of the objects we observed. And we see in the blue region that the slope changes roughly, and then also changes the reflectivity or the relative intensity. All of the intensities are calibrated to star Vega, so they are relative because we also, when you do a spectral reduction, you need to normalize it to some wavelength region, so it's not an absolute intensity, but only a relative. So what we did is we measured the relative flux, which would be the area under the curve, and we measured the gradient or the slope. And here you can see how different objects, these plots are already a lot more clear than the ones before, where you have just a bunch of curves. And you can see that for some of the spectra, for example, here we have a spectrum of Starlink, the gradient is below 0. That means that the spectrum has more reflectivity in blue than in visible. And then we see also ERS2, in this particular spectrum, the slope is negative. However, in the other spectra of ERS2, the yellow and red, the orange and red, it's positive, and that means the spectrum changes. And these are just some of the effects you can investigate from having multiple spectra. And okay, now we add it to the mix laboratory measurements. And those are demonstrated by the stars over here, here, and here. This is the spectrum of aluminum foil, right? So you already see some of the spectra have very similar properties to aluminum over here and over here as well. Now let's add golden Kapton foil, here, here, and there. Already we see some objects with similar properties. And the last thing we're adding is a solar panel, which is over here. And you see, really, there is only one object which would kind of resemble a solar panel in this area. But in the last group, we see quite an overlay over here. And that could be caused because satellites are not made of single type of material, of course. The spectra are a convolution of different types of material, so it makes sense that the regions would overlay. All right, and now let's add 2020 SO to the mix. So we see it's over here, designated by the blue cross. And we have to be careful here because this spectrum was measured by the GTC, so it is a different instrument. So the y-axis is not actually comparable with these measurements. But this is where they would fit at least on the gradient scale. Yeah, I'm already done. All right. And let's have a closer look at the 2020 SO. We see that the spectrum was a little bit shifted on the x-axis, on the wavelength. So in the blue region, we only have a few points. In the visible, we can see that there is a very nice correlation with the Chinese upper stage 43110, and the same in the red region. All right, so some plans for the future. At the moment, we have a lot of data, a lot of measurements, and we are processing them slowly and to make sure that we really account for all the errors, for all the noise and everything. I mean, we have to be very thorough because spectroscopic measurements are not easy. And then we are confronting our observations with laboratory measurements. We have to investigate more into detail the spectra, the convolution, so when you have two different materials demonstrated in one spectrum, and then also the angle of reflection, how that would affect the spectrum and its shape. And then we have to figure out a very, very thorough classification for our spectra based on some wavelength regions, something that we already started. Perhaps machine learning would help us since we have a big sample of data. And then we can observe more targets or perform really targeted observations, so select a particular object and do an observational campaign on that type of object solely. And the last thing that is very curious to me is what would happen if we observe in infrared, because that's where you get a lot of absorption bands also for metal types of materials. So thank you for your attention. Feel free to ask any questions or contact me directly.
Thanks a lot. We have time for a quick question.
So you show some boxes, and then there was a plot where the boxes were overlapping.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what is the size of the box? Is that the error bar or some, why the boxes are no smaller or larger? Why?
No, they were all the same, the boxes, but it was just a selection. I just chose the area to demonstrate where there could be some correlation. But at the moment, there's no scientific principle underneath. I mean, we are trying to find correlations. So we are choosing different methods to find the correlations between the observation and laboratory data.
So it's just a graphic choice? Because if you make the box smaller, there is no overlap.
Yes, of course, yes.
Okay.
Let's thank the speaker again.